I'll go ahead and start. And as you can see, the title of my paper ended up different than it is in the program. So, Law, Authority, Emotion, and Analysis of Maidan Through Legal Acts. Events of the last year in Ukraine revolve around a series of questions. Did law enforcement have the right to act in certain ways? Did the demonstrators? Did the executive branch legally issue certain orders to troops? Did Parliament act legally in passing or constitutionally in passing its helmet laws, or in stripping Yanukovych of presidential power? What authority, if any, did Russian political institutions have in regard to Crimea or the Donbass? These questions expose institutions and authority in formation. These questions also arouse in those on the Maidan and also in us emotion. And as an evidence for that claim, I invite you to look at the list of dates and just attend to one's own inner state when looking at those dates. Law enforcement actions meant to intimidate or laws intended to repress also inspired. From them, the Maidan demonstrators gained numbers and energy. Legal measures brought elation, trepidation, anxiety, jubilation. At the same time that legal acts were meant to have practical effect, they also had emotional effect. The Maidan of 2013-2014 gained intensity from them. This essay takes as its definitional background that the Maidan of 2013-2014 was an assemblage of speech acts, incidents, performances, institutions, and emotions of supporters and opponents. To understand it better, I undertake two lines of inquiry, the first into relationships between law, legitimacy, and authority, and the second into relationships between law and emotion. Brought into conversation with each other, these investigations help us better to understand the emergent politics and publics of the past year in Ukraine, and to reconsider the question, what was the Maidan? First, producing authority. In my paper, I argue that we can perceive three stages at which we see a shift in forms of authority taking place via the Maidan. First stage, protest. Protesting the legality of legal acts or actions taken in the name of law enforcement, challenged normative assumptions that we make about law. The Maidan challenges what David Dreisenhaus calls the standard positivist hypothesis of modernity, that a law or a legal act, and in this, for my paper, I include both legislation and executive orders, that a law or a legal act is valid regardless of its content, regardless of its substance, as long as it was enacted in accordance with formal criteria for valid law. So typically, legality implicates legitimacy. Weber observes, for citizens of a modern state, procedure has become the criterion for legitimacy. Legitimacy is collapsed into legality. So, in other words, typically, a law is seen to be, or a speech act is seen to be legal if the correct procedures have been followed in passing it. And if the correct procedures have been followed, then it is also seen to be legitimate. That's what Weber means by the collapse of legitimacy into legality. Compelling evidence for a belief in the importance of legality we can see even on the Party of Regions. Even in the hardening repression of January 2014, Yanukovych's Party of Regions bothered to pass legislation criminalizing certain protest practices without even looking at the content of these helmet laws of January 16th. What is striking first to me is that they even bothered to pass them as laws. For people who say that the rule of law never existed in Ukraine or is meaningless in Ukraine, I defy them. We see these actors relying on the positivist hypothesis, attempting to establish through legality legitimacy for its crackdown measures. A second challenge then comes to legitimacy. From its beginnings, the Maidan challenged positivism's procedure fetish and the Weberian equivalence of legality and legitimacy. Most came to the Maidan on December 1st, not over whether the president had followed correct procedure in ordering the crackdown on November 30th, but rather out of inchoate shock at state violence against citizens. Legitimacy, not legality, was foremost in mind. Thus arose a second challenge to the positivist and modernist claims. Can a legal act be illegitimate? One answer comes from the president's own faction. In the first defection from Yanukovych's Party of Regions, prominent party member Inna Bohuslavska left the parliamentary faction on November 30th to protest the bloodshed and exhorted other members of parliament to join her. The verdict on the legitimacy of tactics, even among his own party, eventually gathered momentum against Yanukovych, as we all know. Parliament itself repealed the helmet laws. This is something that I learned in my research for this essay. Parliament itself repealed the helmet laws, 9 out of 12 of them, on January 28th, just 12 days after they passed them. In the bloodier days between February 19th and February 21st, so many parliamentarians left the president's faction that it lost its parliamentary majority, as we know. Perhaps the crowning testimony against legitimacy, the verdict against legitimacy, comes from Yanukovych's own flight. But I get ahead of myself. And when I said that, I swiped my keypad. Okay, beginning by contesting whether some laws or orders were per se illegitimate or illegal. Maidan demonstrators took authority itself as their object. In this, I make the claim in the paper, the 2013-2014 demonstrations differed from prior mass demonstrations in Ukraine that may have taken electoral outcomes as their object, like the Orange Revolution, or particular policies, like the Euromaidan demonstrations of November 21st to 30th of 2013, or political maneuvering as their object. For example, the Party of Regions mass demonstrations against Yushchenko's dissolution of parliament, 2006-2007. These latest demonstrations took authority itself as their object, whereas prior mass demonstrations tended to serve one side in disputes between elite political and economic social formations. From any demonstration against, one could have inferred a personified for. Not this time. At a deeper level, this Maidan did not target an election, a policy, or a particular maneuver, but rather the authority from which law is authored. So, first, protesting legality and legitimacy. Second stage, limits. A second step in the evolution of authority on the Maidan involved limits. The concept of jurisdiction connotes an intersection of territory and authoritative speech acts. A jurisdiction is a territory within whose boundaries the speech acts of a certain category of speakers have performative effect. Maidanci established a perimeter which Jennifer Carroll's work shows us worked not only through barricades and checkpoints, but also through discourses of inclusion and exclusion, within which law enforcement was not welcome, and within which the procedurally correct speech acts of state authorities ceased automatically to have performative effect. The Maidan, which for my purposes here, soon encompassed central areas of Kiev beyond the literal Independence Square, and included replicas in some other city and town squares across Ukraine and in other parts of the world, and nomadically as an auto-Maidan. The Maidan formed an island within the normal jurisdiction of the state and a limit on the extension of state authority. After limits, a third stage in a shift in forms of authority involved roles. Law posits a particular relationship between author and authority. Authority in the modern state is predicated or structured on a synecdochic logic wherein a part stands for the whole. Is that clear, or should I spell that out? Okay, and I won't spell it out because there's only 2 minutes, so if there's questions about synecdochic logic, get me in questions. Okay, so what we see is a translation which Professor Goujon showed us yesterday so clearly of a part standing for the whole, the state standing for the public, to the whole standing for the whole, through the nightly meetings on the Maidan, and then an inversion where this new part, the Maidan, was claiming to stand for the whole of Ukraine. So I call that a synecdochic inversion. I also try to trace through that synecdochic inversion a setting for the cultivation of charisma that emerged on the Maidan, which was a collective charisma, not vested in one political leader, but distributed through the crowd. This short review shows some novel modifications which result in new forms of authority like narodovlastye or samopomich, which emerge as vibrant forms of political expression, authority, and legitimacy. Moving on, producing emotion. Sorry, I'm just going to zip through all this. You'll be relieved I'm not going to read to you all of the legal language. The legal acts that drew people to the physical Maidan and that punctuated its dispersed replications and virtual existences produced emotions not commonly associated with law. Why a catalog of emotions is impossible to produce is an interesting research question in itself. In brief, emotion is such an individual and interior experience that a survey would be inadequate to collective experience. Instead, I offer two other concepts. One is affect. Affect is a structural milieu which shapes emotion. And the affect that I identify with the Maidan is pathos. Following Paul Rabinow and Anthony Stavronakis, I distinguish emotion from aspect in several respects. It's a structural milieu and it's a relational state, not an interior one. Through my research, which were interviews between May and July of 2014, and research in the discursive archives of Facebook and Kontaktje, I would admit those are exhausting archives. One affective state I identify arising via the Maidan is pathos. Pathos can be understood through its classical domains, theater and medicine, both of which were prominent on the Maidan. Pathos in medicine, for example, is manifest in the doctor-patient scene, in which bodily materiality and suffering and attempts to understand and compensate for disease, suffering, and finitude take their place. And I quote from Paul Rabinow, with pathos, its presence is diagnostic, in the sense that something seems wrong, a form of care is called for. So my claim in the paper is that people came to the Maidan because of pathos, but why did they stay? They stayed, I'm claiming, because of an emotional register that I identify as thumos. Pathos may have motivated many to join demonstrators, to contribute food supplies, blankets, warm clothes, medical care. The question is, what kept people on the Maidan as repression took a sinister turn? And okay,
so you will have occasion, to develop, yeah.
Okay, so in conclusion, thumos is an ancient Greek term for spiritedness, which I claim existed on both sides of the Maidan. And I claim that pathos and this spiritedness, thumos, we can see extending beyond the Maidan in unexpected ways and places. And I would extend that even among the separatists in Donbass. Thank you.
Thank you.